Welcome to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast. Many thanks for joining us on the Journal of Biophilic Design today. We're really thrilled to be joined by another podcaster, Ross O'Keally. He's the podcast host of the Green Urbanist podcast, which I recommend you all to check out. He's also learning program manager for Design Southeast, and he's the London National Park City Ranger too, which we're going to find out a little bit more about. But Ross, many thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me, and I'm really excited to have this exchange of knowledge with another podcaster, and I love the work you're doing.
That's great. Thank you. And I love the work you're doing too. You've got amazing people you're interviewing, and obviously you're passionate about having greener cities on so many levels, and how that also can help the environment and the well-being and welfare of everybody, plants and animals too, which is wonderful. So well, I mean, maybe from my point of view, I'd love to hear a little bit more about you, kind of what got you into it, kind of what you're doing now. Just give the people a slight flavor of what you're doing.
Absolutely. So I'm an urban designer and a planner by background, and I studied geography as well in university. And I really came into this really having a passion for the natural environment and an understanding that, climate change is very serious and we need to do something about it. But I think probably in the first couple of years of my professional life, just sort of finding my way through the world, working in different positions, maybe sort of lost sight of that side of it. And really, I have to say, in 2018, when there was the Extinction Rebellion protests, particularly in London and in other cities, that sort of really woke me up to how important it is that we as an industry, architects, designers, planners, developers, start really refocusing everything we're doing towards mitigating and adapting to climate change. And I was sort of humbled by myself that I realized that even though I'm someone who's passionate about it, I didn't really know that much about it beyond just the very simplistic stuff. And so at that point in 2018, I started on a kind of personal journey of just educating myself, reading, looking for podcasts and that kind of thing. Of course, we all know what happened after that. The pandemic hit. We all found ourselves stuck at home with a lot more free time than we're used to. And I thought, well, I'm doing all this reading and figuring things out. I'm sure there's other people like me who are on a similar journey. So I sort of, after a lot of months of procrastinating, decided to go and publish a podcast, which I call The Green Urbanist, which I always say is as much for my own education as anyone else's, because it gives me a platform to go and talk to amazing people who are doing fantastic work in sustainability and design. Professionally now, I am working for a non-profit called Design Southeast, and we do a number of things to try and improve the quality and sustainability of design in the southeast of England. And my role is as learning program manager. And so I run basically a curriculum of events and training programs to try and help mostly public sector planning officers, so planning officers who work in local authorities, to upskill in design and sustainability and related topics so they can do their job better, essentially. And then you also mentioned about London National Park City, so I'll fill you in a little bit on that. And this is a huge topic as well. But if you think about the great national parks of the world, places like Yosemite in the US, or even like the Lake District, or the great wilderness, sort of intact bits of wilderness in Scotland, all of those are very rural. They were quite far away from people. It takes quite a lot of effort and maybe a certain amount of money and free time to go and actually spend time with those. And so a movement was started in London years ago, which was the idea that, well, London has so much amazing nature in it as well. What if London and other cities could also be considered as national parks and people could just live in them? And we really took seriously and reimagined what the nature in cities actually means if we started to consider them as national parks. So 3 years ago, almost to the month, the Mayor of London basically took this movement really seriously, which had grown from a grassroots movement, and had signed officially that London is actually a national park. And so that's where National Park City comes from. So it has that formal designation from the Mayor of London. And that's now starting to spread around the world. Adelaide in Australia is the second national park city in the world. And there's many, many others that have campaigns to do the same. So a really inspiring movement that's spreading globally. And for us, what we do as rangers, we're basically volunteers. We don't go riding around on horseback through the parks of London, which is probably the image you have of a ranger. But we basically are 150 people across the capital who have different skill sets, come from different walks of life. Some of us are artists, some people are ecologists, some people are PhD students, other people are just people who are working like at the ground level in communities, getting greening happening in their local neighborhoods. So we're doing a variety of things, but really our goal is to do anything that makes London greener, healthier and wilder. And so, you know, you can imagine there's a huge array of things and activities happening around that.
Wow, it must be amazing. I mean, you must get really positive feedback as well. You know, I mean, see, a ranger, you would assume you're sort of wandering around actually in location and stuff. I mean, do you get to interact with people and you kind of, they ask you questions, or, you know, is there like a sort of theme of what they ask? Is it like, are there certain things that people ask you? Or
I think one of the things we're really trying to do with the National Park City movement is spreading the awareness about it. A lot of Londoners still don't know that they live in a designated national park, but also a lot of the local authorities and the policymakers and landowners and people who have the real ability to make big change in the city also don't know about it. And so a big thing we're trying to do is to sort of on one hand, just to spread awareness and to celebrate the fact and celebrate all the great things and to get people inspired to go out and use the natural assets that we have in the city. And then the other side of it is doing more. And so that's trying to find ways to support people who are working locally, trying to support sort of nature interaction. So, you know, there's something that was started by one of the rangers. It's called the London Fungus Network. Which is fantastic. And it's just a little organization that sort of exists to connect people to mushrooms and other fungi in the city. And they do things like foraging sessions where they bring people out into parks and they teach them about mushrooms and about the amazing role they play in ecosystems. You know, what ones to eat, what ones you shouldn't eat, and that kind of thing. So there's all sorts of fantastic things going on. From my point of view, what I'm involved in is there's also a London National Park City podcast, which I'm helping out on, which is called the Regrowth Project. That's fantastic. And I know I'm biased, but honestly, really, really good. And yeah, we've also held events. We held an online event, which had, I think, like a couple of hundred people come to from around the world, which is all about urban greening and city resilience. So yeah, a lot of it is really, I think, at this point about information sharing and supporting local initiatives that are happening. But I think over the next couple of years, you're going to see the movement get stronger and stronger. And I really hope starts to play more of a role like at the upper decision making. So I'd love to see councils and politicians actually paying more attention to it in that sort of way. Yeah,
I think that's one of those. So when you're saying, I mean, you know, I'm always advocating and trying to sort of like bang that drum that to bring more greenery to, you know, to where you are, if you know what I mean. So you don't have to go too far to find some greenery, so you can hang out and, you know, and it's all about this equity side of things as well, that it doesn't matter what, you know, how rich or poor you are. We all have access to greenery and water and sort of canals, and that is that what it is. It's like the whole network, like sort of like the big parks and the small pocket parks and the canals and waterways. And is that the kind of thing that
so we have this amazing map that we produced, which shows all the green and blue spaces in London.
Oh, right. Wow, really? How can you find that? Sorry, how can you find that?
Yes, it should. I think the website is nationalparkcity.london, and that has all the resources and information on it. But something that the sort of mapping exercise told us was, I think it's 48% of London's surface area is green and blue.
Wow, amazing.
And so that includes everyone's back gardens, as well as the public parks, the canals, the rivers, the swimming ponds, and all that kind of stuff. So it really tells you that, you know, you can look out and it feels like quite a grey, hard city, but actually, you know, almost half of it is a natural surface of some sort. And we want to see that, you know, increase even more and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's I think making people aware actually of what amazing things we have. There's another friend of mine, a ranger, who runs an Instagram page called Fruity Walks, which there's all these really whimsical people who are involved in this.
Brilliant, though. Fantastic.
And she's going around London and taking pictures and documenting the stories of fruit trees all over London.
Wow.
And she's found some amazing things, like the typical sort of British fruit you'd find, like apples and pears, of course, are more common than you might think. A lot of parks actually in London have orchards, which is fantastic. But also she's found quite exotic things. She's found in an estate in Bermondsey, someone has a lemon tree in their garden, which produces fruit every year. And she's found, I think somewhere she found an avocado tree as well, which is like unbelievable that can thrive in London. But yeah, it's, I think little things like that, they can seem quite small, but I think there's a lot of wonder out there, I think, in the sort of urban natural world. And we sort of are trying to get used to sort of looking for it a bit more and looking at those details.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, isn't it? Like you say, if you've got like a guide or a map or something which can open your eyes, I mean, like podcasting and all this kind of stuff, if you can share that information and get people excited about it, and sort of engage them in a different way, very practically, like you say, the sort of, what was it called, the fruity, what was it called,
Fruity Walks.
The Fruity Walks. I mean, what a cool thing.
And at Fruity Walks on Instagram.
There's so many wonderful trees and like, the urban farms and things as well. These sort of projects that are setting up in like in a city, what you would think of as normally barren areas. You kind of turn around the corner and there's lots. I mean, I was born in London, and my mother's family were all London, like from like 1800s, and my mum always used to say, like, the plane trees and all this sort of stuff, and the green belt and everything. It's all been the lungs of London, and and it's just from an early age she inspired me to kind of look to see trees everywhere in London.
Yeah.
And so I already have a leaning towards that, to kind of have my eyes open. But I didn't realize that there was it 46%, did you say?
48%, I think.
48% of London is covered by greenery. That's great. I think a lot of cities and a lot of towns could take it, sorry, excuse the pun, but take a leaf out of that book. I think sorry, that's really bad, isn't it? It's great. Personally, what sort of do you think are the greatest challenges that cities are finding, right now, that's sort of impacting the environment? There might be sort of stopping them from actually implementing this stuff, or or just generally, are there any particular factors that you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so many shared challenges across many cities across the world. And I think we could talk about air pollution. We could talk about a lack of nature in cities, a lack of biophilia. We could talk about too many cars, too much car traffic, and all this kind of thing. But I think if at the root of many of the problems that we're seeing in cities and urban areas, I believe is, and I'm going to go a bit out there here, but stay with me, listeners. I believe that we have sort of forgotten the fact that we as humans are actually animals. And that, if you were a zoologist and you were designing an enclosure for an animal, a good zoologist who wanted to keep the animal happy and healthy would go to their natural habitat and try to understand what that looks like, and then they would do their best to recreate that in a zoo. And it's never perfect, but it's moving in the right direction towards recreating that. There's a similar argument to be made, I think, for humans, which is that we are now a predominantly urban species, but we're not really supposed to be here. Like, we've sort of domesticated ourselves in a sense. The word domestication comes from the Latin domus, which means house. Who's the one living in the house? It's us. So we've domesticated ourselves, and as over the course of human history has happened in a relatively quick period of time. And so a good way of visualizing this is, so me and you, Vanessa, are what you'd call anatomically modern humans. And us as a species, we've looked like this. We've been very similar for the past 350,000 years, more or less. If you want to visualize that, get a big blackboard and draw a line that is 3.5 meters long. So that represents 350,000 years. And then you basically we for most of that time we were living as hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
So basically we were staying more or less in a small location, a couple of kilometers across. We were living in tune with nature. We were getting everything we need from the environment. We were part of sort of these natural cycles and that kind of thing. That all changed about 10,000 years ago, spontaneously across the world. Many people started developing agriculture. And from that, society and civilization took off to the point where we were building cities about 7,000 years ago. And then we started inventing the sort of mass religions and capitalism and the steam engine and fossil fuels, and all of that started to boom, 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 happen really, really fast. And if you map that out, so you've got your 3.5 meter long line, the last centimeter is the last 10,000 years. And so that tells you that we are basically, the way we're living now is not normal in the sense of the scale of us living on the earth as a species. And perhaps at the root of many of the health and the social problems that we're facing in urban environments, as well as the environmental problems of us causing global climate change, I think lies at the root that we've forgotten where we've come from.
Mm-hmm.
And I really believe that's something I would like to see an understanding brought into sort of the urbanist professions, architecture, planning, urban design, etc. Is it understanding that we as animals have certain needs and we've evolved for a certain habitat or different kinds of habitats, and that in cities we need to be moving towards actually recreating that as best we can. And once you take that perspective, actually, you know, it opens up a whole world of how the built environment might change. And we can get into a couple of examples of that as well. But I've been, for people who are maybe sparked by this idea, I've been working on like a multi-part podcast series on this. So I have 3 episodes out now with the title Primal City. So there's part 1, part 2, part 3. I'm working on a part 4. I might keep going if I keep having more ideas. But that might be a good place to start for people who are interested in this idea.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I recommend people to go and have a listen to it. It's really, really good. It's eye-opening, it's inspiring, and it gets people, gets your thoughts going about how you can do it yourself as well. You know, and it helps that when you're talking to people, yeah, adding words to your argument, as it were. It was interesting you mentioned about sort of zoology and animals, and it's true. We're animals. We are nature. We are living, breathing. We're all part of that ecosystem, if you want. I interviewed Nigel Osland recently, and he's written a book called Workplace Zoo, and he talks about the landscaped office, you know, sort of the Landschaftsbüro, where how we need to create different spaces within a workplace where we can thrive. You know, we can flourish in each little tiny bit, you know, so sometimes we might need a bit quiet space, we need this, whatever, but, you know, we need a, noisy place where everybody's thing, or we need some chill out time. So actually, like, just going back on that thing of like, we are animals, we are actually, you wouldn't, and he talks about the zoo thing, you wouldn't put, you know, a giraffe in like the polar bear enclosure, and you wouldn't put the polar bear in like, you know, the armadillo enclosure. You just don't do it. You have to go do things that are relevant to that species. And as you said, you know, on that timeline, what a great way of describing it. That's so brilliant that last bit on that string is where we've been, but actually this whole 3.2 meters worth of string was with primal. We were outside, you know, we were living and we were thriving outside, and you know, sometimes we were being eaten as well, but that's great. That's, you know, that's also our mindset of like, you know, even like putting our back to the wall and having this prospect and refuge and all these sort of things that we need to have, we need to bear in mind when we're creating workplaces and homes and spaces where we're all going to live our best lives, really, you know. Really,
I think that's, you know, I think that's an interesting point you bring up about the, you know, we are sort of a predator and a prey species at the same time. We often think of humans as being the top of the food pyramid. Actually, we're kind of somewhere in the middle. You know, a lion or a wolf would be very happy to find a a lone human, defenseless, you know.
I was going to say exactly. I mean, it's like with acoustics, you know, so the whole thing about biophilia is like, you know, it's like we talk about trying to create better environments that are not so reverberating, you know, so by putting plants and soft furnishings and that kind of stuff creates that whole thing of like living outside, you know, as Andrea Harmon says, no, nature doesn't have walls, you know, so
Right.
there's no four walls around us, it's just open. And Paige Husband of Ecofon, she talks about how we could just open a window, open a door, and actually that's one of the best forms of acoustics. Yeah, I think it's just vitally important that we create something. Anyway, just we talk about this sort of like, you know, creating sort of dampening a sound in a very loud and reflective environment, but we don't want silence either. So like we were just saying, you know, we're also a prey species, and we're kind of, so when it's completely silent, there's a big storm coming, or there's a piece of danger when it's completely silent. So we always need a little bit of noise, you know, but we need some good noise. We need some birds, or we need some water or whatever as well. So yeah.
There's one other thing as well, I think I'd like to bring up just in response to this question of what are the challenges we're facing.
Yeah.
And I think it's very on the top of my mind at the moment, because in the UK last week we just experienced an incredible heat wave.
Yeah.
The all-time temperature record was broken 2 days in a row. It got up to 40 degrees, above 40 degrees Celsius. So I think it's very clear to us now that we're living in climate change. It's no longer something that might come in the future. It's something that we're in now. There's a lot of good people working on mitigating the effects of climate change, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. We know that much. And so I think there's a really big need very quickly to bring in the language of climate adaptation into the urban professions. Climate adaptation just means that we recognize the fact that we're living with the effects of climate change, and therefore our behavior and our infrastructure needs to change to ensure safety and the health, and hopefully the happiness and the thriving of people who live in urban environments. British cities and buildings were never designed for temperatures, above 40 degrees, even above 30 degrees, things, we really start to struggle. And so there's a huge challenge now, if that's going to start to become more expected every year, is actually the what do we do to ensure, first of all, that, to try and bring down the excess deaths that do happen every time there's a heat wave. And then, that's sort of, I think, the priority. So looking at people who are vulnerable, people with pre-existing conditions who are most at risk, I think should be the priority for adaptation. And then the other is just the rest of us who maybe can survive through a heat wave, but are just absolutely miserable through it. And there's also, lost economic activity. There's also increased crime rates every time there's a heat wave. That's a phenomenon that's been studied, in that, once the temperature starts to break above that which people feel comfortable in, they're more likely, there are more instances of things like violent crime, for instance. And so, these are the things that we're starting to see happen. And I think as it happens, we're on the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast, bringing more nature into cities is one of the best ways, actually, of adapting to a changing climate. And so, for instance, all of us in the heat wave became shade-seeking people. We didn't want to be out sunbathing anymore. We wanted to be hiding under a tree or in an air-conditioned place. And so, increasing that level of canopy cover in cities. And I read a study a while ago that said that something like 40% canopy cover. So if you look up, the sky should be almost half filled with the branches and leaves of trees, is kind of optimal for bringing cooling in our sort of climate. So obviously, you just look out the window, we have a long way to go. There's a lot of trees in London. London has some fantastic trees, but we have a long way to go to make sure everyone has that equitable cover of shade. Trees and more natural materials like soil and planting, it's also fantastic for minimizing flooding as well, because instead of all that water just sitting on the streets and entering into the basements and ground floors of your house, it just soaks down into the soil, which is exactly what it would do in a natural environment.
Yeah.
So a huge case. We're only getting more and more reasons to bring more nature into cities, I suppose I would say.
Exactly. 'Cause I read as well that it reduces the temperature by like something like 50%. It does. It really makes a big difference. Also, I interviewed Dr. Joanna Leach. She's a research fellow at Birmingham University, and she was talking about the benefits of having trees, like you're saying, for soaking up runoff and all this kind of thing. We're losing our topsoils and like you're saying, the flooding and the more things we've got that actually drink the water naturally, it makes sense, and we're going to see this. We're going to see I think there's supposed to be some flooding coming. I think they've been saying that. So we've got the heat wave, we've got the drying, and then because the soil is getting harder and compact, more compact. So when the rain comes, it's just going to
can't soak in.
It's going to find the lowest point, isn't it? Which, as you say, could be your basement, could be your house, and then all that sort of comes with that, economic and also lives lost.
Exactly.
So water. I'm really interested in like bringing water and waterscapes into the built environment, whether that's through canals or introducing fountains, or we're all drawn to this whole blue mind thing. I think blue is the favorite color for most people. But in cities, it's just so important because it makes you feel alive as well. There's getting more studies that have been done that prove that we just thrive. It just makes us happy and reduces the temperature again in a city with the water, the cooling of the water.
Paris is really leading on this because they, back in I think 2004, in France in particular, there was a really deadly heat wave, and that sort of snapped them into action. And they, the municipalities just said, we need to have heat wave action plans, and we need to start rolling out things to make sure this doesn't happen again. Which we should really learn from in the UK, because I think, when the heat wave hit last week, there was really nothing, the government wasn't really rolling out anything to help people. They were just saying, stay indoors, drink plenty of water, deal with it yourselves, basically. But anyway, something that Paris is doing is they're bringing a lot more water and access to water for people. And so they're sort of helped by this, because a sort of historic urban design thing in French cities is having fountains. So there's lots of beautiful little squares that have a fountain. And so what they've done is, they keep those running so people can at least go and touch the water, but they've also started adding things like misters. So you can you'll walk along, and then at a certain point in the street, there'll just be somewhere that is just shooting mist out. So you can just stand there for a second and get the cooling, from the mist. They do that in
Vegas. I was going to say they do that in Vegas as well. I remember being like, well, what's going on here? But then they do everything in Vegas. So yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And they've opened up. I mean, I remember seeing photos of these sort of shallow ponds, shallow pools by the Eiffel Tower, in the park along the Eiffel Tower, and people were just in there bathing, during the heat wave. So giving people free and equitable access actually to water and bathing spots is really effective as well.
I was going to say, have you ever been to the King's Cross Granary Square? Just the regeneration they've done there, and they've got these little fountains that are there, and it's great if you sit there with a coffee, you're just like people watch, and is it really interesting, especially different times of the day. You get like some kiddies that come along that kind of playing around there, but then you see business people like they kick their shoes off, they roll this, and they're like they're sort of walking around in the fountains. It was just like it brings back this kind of childlike nature within us, that this desperate connection to be near water. It's it's quite an amazing thing. You spoke about like obviously more trees, and we've just said about water being in the thing. Is there anything else that we could do you think, that we can reverse the trend away from the non-greening? I know that there's been a thing recently the government have put out. They said that we need to have more green in the city, but what do you think? I mean, is there who do we need to get involved? I mean, obviously we need the government, we need town planners, we need mayors, we need all those people, but have you had a thought about a kind of way of we could do that?
No, it's a really good question, and I think really quickly when you start thinking about these things, you have to go from theory to practice really quickly, so we don't really have time to sort of just sit around talking about these things for too long. We have to figure out how to make them happen. Something that really struck me when I started working with London National Park City and meeting the other rangers who are more involved than I am in local community greening projects, is that there's so many people all throughout the city who are really ambitious, who have a lot of energy, who want to give their time to making their street or their neighborhood more green and more biodiverse, more biophilic. But there's so many barriers put up in place of them doing that, and a lot of them are bureaucratic. And so, you know, I started my career working in a local authority down in Brighton, and I work a lot now with local authorities across the southeast. And I really, really feel their pain of being so short-staffed and underfunded, and really not having the time or the ability or even the thinking space to do the things that are not, you know, the minimum that they're required to do by law. But I think we're missing a huge opportunity in the fact that when let's say a local person says, I want to get some street trees put on my street. We have no trees. It's really grey. I want to do it. I'm going to get some volunteers from the street to plant it. We're going to get someone to donate the trees. And they said, but we need permission from the council to do it. And so first of all, they don't know who to talk to. So there's no like direct line. So then they sort of spend ages scrolling through the council website, which is always a labyrinth. And then they eventually find someone in maybe like the parks department. And then they try to contact them. They don't get any response, you know, and then eventually they get contact and the person says, well, you know, I don't think this is really a good idea. It's not really in our plan. You know, I'm not sure if this is going to work. And, you know, I've had that experience as well, contacting my local council with an idea that I was really excited about, that I thought they'd really get on board with. And they said, oh, well, there's going to be loads of problems with that. We can see this is going to go wrong and we don't know how to handle this. So I think what I would love to see, and something I want to work on with the rest of the Rangers, is sort of a list of tasks, or a list of requests, or a list of sort of a process that local authorities can use to sort of unlock the power of their local communities to do this really important local greening and climate adaptation that I know they want to do, but they're just not given the time and the resources to do it. So yeah, let's see. I hopefully we'll get a look into that over the next few months and can report back with some findings. But it seems like there needs to be a much more streamlined process, that if you see local people who want to do something that, you know we have to do anyway, which is urban greening, we should all be getting behind. We should be making it really easy for them to do that.
Yeah. Well, I hope you do write, report back on it. So I'm launching the magazine in October this year. So maybe you could have like a column so you can keep us updated on how that goes, because I think that's really important. Because it's always having a roadmap for people, isn't it? As well, for both parties, the community, people that want, that, as you say, there's lots of people wanting to do good stuff, and then you don't know where to go, and if you do, it kind of falls at the first hurdle because someone's overworked, which is natural, they're understaffed and all this kind of thing. But there is a way, there must be a way, because there has to be a way, really.
Yeah, exactly.
So fantastic. So yeah, I'll be on at you to write me articles, like give me updates. Word from the park as well. I think I'd quite like that. You and the squirrels, that'd be good.
Fantastic.
Oh, brilliant. Well, from my point of view, I always ask this question to everybody at the end of my podcast. It's kind of like a sort of magic question. If you could paint the world with a magic brush of biophilia, what would it look like?
Great question. I love that because it gets your imagination running. One of the most profound biophilic experiences that I have is every year I go camping with some friends in the South Downs in the south of England. And we go to this very basic campsite, which is basically just a field, and it's surrounded by ancient woodland. And so every morning at sort of 5 a.m., we get woken up by the dawn chorus.
Okay, yeah.
Which is this amazing phenomenon in this sort of part of the world where once the sun starts to rise in the morning, all the birds wake up and they immediately start singing, all of them together. And it's like when you go to a properly intact, dense woodland, it's like a symphony.
Yeah.
It's really, you can't describe it. You have to sort of, I'm sure people can find recordings of it online, but the best thing to do is actually go and try and experience it yourself. It's really, really amazing and beautiful, and it gives you a sense that there is still wildness around. You don't get that in the city. So I live in zone 2 in London, which is quite, quite inner city. Mostly what I get is a few belligerent seagulls. So quite have the same effect. What I would love to see as my sort of biophilic vision is thinking about that auditory experience of, imagine if you were woken up in the morning in the summer by a dawn chorus in the city. I think that would be a really profound thing, because not only is it a really joyous thing, but it might also help to kind of connect us back to our circadian rhythms. So this sort of natural wake and sleep cycle that many of us have lost because we can basically shine artificial blue lights, and we can sit in front of a screen all day, and it messes up our circadian rhythms. Now, it might be quite annoying for people who want to sleep in, who are constantly getting woken up at 6 a.m. But I think, I just think that would be a really, really beautiful vision. And I think as well, it's maybe there's a bit of a magic about thinking about the end point, because I've been talking throughout this about, we need to plant more trees, we need more greening. But then what's the end point? Like, how do we know we've been successful? And maybe a marker of success is that we've recreated a sort of a woodland habitat in the city to the point where the birds are happy enough there to have a dawn chorus. So yeah, there you go. That's what I would think of.
Thank you for listening to the Journal of Biophilic Design podcast.